She smiled through her tears. Ina has to see the doctor every other day, otherwise she would not be allowed to sing at the cabaret. Suddenly she covered her face with her hands. My God, what have we done to deserve all this? First the NKVD and death always lurking, and now this. I stood up and tiptoed out. There was nothing I could say. In the courtyard, Anna's little daughter recognized me and came running excitedly. Pan Eric! Pan Eric! I gave her my entire daily ration and stuffed her pockets with rubles and marks. Remind them to keep me in mind. The vehicle roared. Rostov had been reduced to ruins by an unusual Luftwaffe attack. On its main street, a banner waved, "Soldier, beware, deadly Asian venereal diseases." Before crossing the big bridge over the Don River, we made a brief stop. We wanted to see the places where we had stayed and had been stationed the previous December. People were frightened. Rostov had been practically destroyed by Stukas. An Anshara came out of a building whose roof had been consumed by fire. I closed my eyes for a moment, but he had recognized me and approached me laughing. "Walter," I said to him in confusion, "how is that possible?" He took a deep breath and looked at his wristwatch. "My leave train leaves in 3 hours. You can take my word for that." He joined us in the vehicle and rolled a cigarette with trembling hands. He began to tell us his story. In the middle of the night, the spies woke us up. His face was white as snow. "We are lost," he stammered. "Ivan is already in town." We were on our feet in an instant. The spies didn't know much more than we did. We had never dressed so quickly before. Of course, the vehicle would not start as the driver cursed and worked like a madman to get it going. A messenger arrived. He had already been wounded. "You won't be able to get out that way," he shouted. And indeed, we heard small arms fire coming from the road in the direction of Taganrog, to our rear. A shiver ran down my spine. An Untersturmführer, who had apparently also been sleeping, joined us. "Keep calm, men," he said in an effort to reassure us. A shell from an anti-tank gun howled over our heads in the direction of the road and embedded itself in the wall of a building. "How rude," laughed the Untersturmführer. In the middle of his sentence, he stopped and slowly fell to the ground. "Medic!" shouted the spy for no apparent reason, as a medic was already attending to the Untersturmführer. He had been wounded all over the chest. "Leave me alone," he stammered with great effort. "Get away from me." Naturally, we lifted the Untersturmführer into the first vehicle that finally started. Our own vehicle continued to resist for some time, but finally got going as well. Already there was heavy fighting in the next street, and the cold was breathtaking. Just as we were about to get into our vehicle, a machine gun burst from very close range landed in our midst. As I was not yet in the vehicle, I was not wounded. All the other comrades getting in, about 8 in all, were wounded. The spy collapsed with a laugh in front of my feet. He had been a father of 4 children. "Get out of here," I thought to myself. "Get out of here." I ran back into the yard and bumped into someone. It was the blonde Kuchia, at the place where we were staying. You should know that this blonde was also in her 30s, but then I found out she was only 25. She had been very cold to us, and I had barely spoken to her. Without a word, she took me by the hand and dragged me into the house. However, we didn't go upstairs to the 2nd floor where she lived. Instead, we went down to the basement. He took me all the way down, opened a small storage room and instructed me to lie down there. Then he covered me with a couple of old sacks and disappeared. So there I was, lying there with my gun in my hand, ready to shoot. I don't know if it was the cold or the excitement, but I won't deny that I was shaking. Outside, they were shooting like crazy. Suddenly I heard a young, high-pitched voice say, "Don't take too much time, you fuckers." A few shots rang out, and then everything went silent. Rough footsteps echoed on the stairs. I slowly raised my pistol, although there was only a dim light in the basement. I immediately recognized the padded uniforms and fur caps. Suddenly the blonde stood next to them and laughed. She said something and then walked over to me. So that's what's going to happen, I thought in an instant. But then she turned and left the basement with the Red Army soldiers. Despite the cold, I was drenched in sweat when it was quiet in the basement again. A few hours later, the woman returned and brought me a whole loaf of bread. Then she gestured for me to stay where I was. It wasn't until the next night that she returned, bringing me hot soup and bread. This game was repeated for a whole week. Then I developed a fever. Katusha took my temperature with her hand and shook her head in a concerned manner. That night, she brought me 2 blankets and a bottle of hot tea and vodka. In spite of everything, I think I spent more than a week in the basement, half unconscious, alternating between sleep and wakefulness. When I finally felt better, our forces had already retreated some 80 kilometers. I was deep into Red Army territory. One night, the Ukrainian woman brought me a quilted jacket and a fur cap. She hid my cap, cloak and tunic completely behind the jackets and took me to her apartment. He provided me with a hiding place behind the beds where Katushka and his elderly mother slept. I spent the whole day there, only coming out of my hiding place at night, when the apartment was locked and the windows were carefully covered. I was there month after month while she worked in an armaments factory as an accountant. I was literally buried alive, and only Kushka's old mother knew of my existence. Then, suddenly, the front began to approach again, and the whole of Rostov was full of Red Army soldiers, all agitated. Katushka took me back to the cellar one night, fearing that the soldiers were staying in her building. Toward morning, I was startled awake by a deafening roar that filled the room. The Stukas were bombing Rostov. The whole building was shaking and shuddering like a ship in a storm. I thought to myself, the 2 women. I wanted to go upstairs, but a direct hit put an end to all my thoughts. When I awoke, it was broad daylight. Light was pouring in through the gaping hole in the basement, and I could hear small arms fire and the creaking of tank tracks. To the right, outside, someone shouted. I flinched as if I had been struck by lightning. The words had been in German. I shouted for help, and indeed they heard me. One of them shouted, "Clear your cage!" I made my way back, and when the charge burst, I felt the air rush out of me, but the hole was big enough, and with some difficulty, I managed to get out. I found myself looking down into the rifle muzzles of the mechanized infantrymen of the Wiking division, who were minding their own business. I made my report to the Untersturmführer with some difficulty. Then I wanted to look for the woman, but the house was a heap of rubble, and there were no survivors. Then I was interrogated and gave my statement. Now he concluded that it was time to leave. "Walter," I said as I tapped him on the shoulder, "you're a lucky guy." He looked at me and nodded, then we shook hands in silence. He headed for the local military administration headquarters, and we continued on our way. Finally, we arrived at the Viking division, which was in the process of preparing to cross the Kuban. I was assigned to the tank destroyer battalion. We moved through shoulder-high tobacco fields in full bloom, sunflower fields, and rolling fields of grain. For me, it was a relief to find myself in the middle of heavy combat a few hours later. The anti-tank battalion was composed almost entirely of self-propelled guns, armed with the old Russian 7.62-centimeter gun, a very respectable caliber. Unfortunately, their disadvantage was that they were as big as a barn door, over 3 meters high and of the same length. However, their armor was so pitifully thin that any anti-tank shell went through like a knife through butter. In reality, we were protected only against infantry weapons and not even completely, as the gunner and loader were exposed at the rear. We suffered many casualties as a result. We came to a swampy area, and the village in front of us was in the hands of the enemy, who clung tenaciously and would not budge. We made a quick decision and set fire to the thatched roofs to dislodge the enemy. Within minutes, after opening fire with incendiary shells, the first houses were ablaze. Then the infantry began to advance successfully. Following my orders, I moved my gun to the centre of the town square to cover the infantry attack against possible surprises from the south, but not a single enemy tank was in sight. I got down for a moment while the infantry advanced. At that moment, an old woman came running out into the street from one of the burning houses, her hair in disarray over her face. "Janzi," she called, panting. "Tell me, German, is there a god? Bog?" I looked at her and then nodded. Da, Bog estimated." The old woman turned triumphantly to a group of younger and younger women and shouted in a very loud voice, "There you have it. Here is the first German. You must believe it. You have never believed what I have told you. He says that there is a God, that God exists, and that everything will be all right again." I returned to my position of cannon commander, and we advanced together with the infantry to the end of the village. That was Russia, with houses on fire, the world collapsing around them, and the old woman was not thinking about saving herself and her belongings, because God was more important. How could these people be governed with rational laws and programs, unless it was by the methods of the Bolsheviks, the system we were destroying? Our division then advanced beyond Mop into the mountains above Tuap, where it was to act as a covering force. Actually, we seemed to be at rest and relaxation. There was a blissful calm in the forests of the North Caucasus. The Soviets, who had been pushed against the steep mountain slopes, where they led a miserable existence, could hardly influence our movements, let alone interfere with them. The people in this part of the world were poor, desperately poor, worse fed and clothed than anywhere else we had seen. They were mainly Russians from White Russia who had settled there as lumberjacks. Most of them lived in lumberjack colonies, pathetic clusters of small log cabins and small plots of land. Somehow I could never fully understand these people despite all their misery. They had a streak of cunning and malice on the whole that presented a striking difference from the cheerful Ukrainians who, despite Bolshevism, were relatively well off by comparison. Except for skirmishes at outposts and combat patrols, there was not much activity. Despite the peace and quiet of life in the high forest, we were not sad when we were suddenly pulled out and put back on the road to the east. Our positions were occupied by Alpine troops, part of those brave and doomed formations that were later almost completely bled to death in vain in the fighting around Tuap. We continued eastward, again passing through Armavir and Padney. Looking at a map was not good for the nerves, as it showed that we were 3,000 kilometers from the borders of Germany, and yet we were still moving eastward. Rumour had it that we were to move directly towards the Caspian Sea to go around the left flank of the Caucasus, but suddenly we found ourselves approaching the Terek River. We crossed it in the dead of night on a wooden bridge. After several weeks of calm, the Red Air Force was active again and accompanied us day and night. Night. Our guns were so camouflaged with small trees and branches that they looked like nothing more than moving bushes. Once across the Terek, we came to a large village that surprised us by its order and cleanliness, but also by its total lack of life. We noticed a sign in German on one of the houses with elaborate Gothic lettering, BR Laden. Each house had a small rose garden in front of it, with rose-covered pavilions and hedges. The church glowed a dazzling white. We were in the last German colony, Gardberg. Sometime in the 19th century, a religious sect was founded in Verberg by people who believed they could find the way to paradise. To safeguard their path, this sect requested permission from the Tsar to found a number of villages in and around this area. The Tsar, eager to have some hard-working Germans and industrialists in his country, enthusiastically gave his consent. 7 large villages sprang up along the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, across the Kuban and into the Caucasus. These villages were to function as resting stations for German pilgrims on their journey to paradise. However, the flow of the faithful ceased, and these 7 villages were left in the middle of the Russian Empire like a handful of grains scattered by the wind. They were symbols both of German sectarianism and of German piety and industry. The people of Gnadenburg soon entered into friendly relations with the Khakas, and sometimes with their neighbours, the KFFs and Carbines, to whom they paid an annual tribute as insurance against fire and plunder from the fierce hill tribes. If anyone from outside had intentions with Gardberg, the Muslim Caucasians and German Christians fought side by side against the invaders. But the village had been swept clean by the NKVD, and not a single German woman or child was to be seen in the early days of the war. 98 men from the village, along with the village schoolmaster, had been deported to the Ukraine, where they were forced to dig tank trenches and build defences. Led by their brave teacher, they took the opportunity afforded by a German surprise attack to break through to the German lines, and from then on served as interpreters and guides in many different German regiments. All 99 of them had returned home. Standing despairingly in front of their damaged, looted, and now empty houses, they walked as if in a dream through barns and houses, touched the boards they had nailed firmly together a few years ago, and stroked the damaged crucifixes their wives had brought with them in marriage. Then they stood in bewildered groups in the orderly street of the little village. "My mother is 62 years old," the schoolteacher told me with an expressionless expression. "Where did she die? Where is she now, starving and freezing to death right now? It's a heavy cross God has given us to bear. I don't know what we have done to deserve it. Our entire lives have been spent in unceasing labour and righteousness, like the history of Nardenburg itself. But God must know what he wants in all this madness of the past decades. There must be someone who knows where we are headed. Soon after leaving Nardenburg, our mission became clear. To clear the old Georgian military road, the Grinya Duga, and then advance toward Vladikavkaz, or Shikida, as the Bolsheviks had renamed it, in order to open the road to Tiflis. Our hearts sank a little at the sight of the high Caucasus Mountains on the horizon, but nevertheless, we approached the coming battle full of confidence. The next morning, leaflets rained down on us amidst the bombs dropped by the Red Air Force. They said, "Each one of you is marching to his death. The Caucasus will be the meat grinder of Hitler's armies." The men laughed and threw the leaflets away or put them to a more useful use, as we were short of paper. I was in a better mood than I had been in a long time, because it seemed that the German command was trying to avoid making the same mistakes in the Caucasus as in the Ukraine. Relations were particularly good with the Muslim tribes, and volunteer cavalry units were being formed throughout the Caucasus, which later rendered valuable service as reconnaissance forces and even in combat. We constantly saw the green flag of the Prophet flying next to ours. A strict order was issued that the Caucasian tribes were our friends and were to be treated as such in all circumstances, even in the most trivial things. Vigorous propaganda was directed to foster mutual understanding, with considerable success. With the exception of a few minor cases, the men mainly responsible for this intelligent and proper treatment of the Caucasian peoples were two political advisers attached to General Oberst K's staff, Cavalry General Krin and Cavalry General von Heratkin. The latter was the son of a German bookseller in Moscow and had spent his youth in the Russian capital. At the beginning of the Russian campaign, he fell into disgrace for drawing attention to the true strength of the Red Army and was then forgotten in the Grunwald. It was K who remembered him and asked to be posted as a political advisor, an arrangement that proved beneficial both to Germany and to the many Caucasian tribes, the Kachetos, Karadins, Ingush, Azanis, and Kalmuks. This historic land, in whose mountain villages the Promethean legend is as alive today as it was 1,000 years ago, has always been a problem for the Russians. It was there that Shamil, the leader of the Muslim hill tribes in the 19th century, fought his epic lifelong struggle. It was also there that Russian divisions had to use tanks, artillery and aircraft to break the last resistance of the hill tribes in 1934. This fertile and strangely beautiful land, said by some to be the cradle of mankind, could not be subdued by the Kremlin's men. The German tanks were entering this magical land, where the golden eagles described their eternal circles high in the deep blue sky. The black kite, the most beautiful of all Caucasian birds of prey, swooped curiously over our heavy columns. Leopards and black bears shyly backed away from our arrival in the vast forests. In the shade of the dense mountain forests of the Caucasus, the black leopards watched us with distrust as the German Alpines hoisted the German flag on the steep mountain peaks. We received our first lessons on the civilian population. One of the most important things to remember was never to express admiration. It's risky to say to a Caucasian, "Wow, those are nice pants," or "What a beautiful horse." The owner will instantly give it to you, no matter how precious or valuable it is, expecting, of course, an equally valuable gift in return. Failure to do so is considered a breach of etiquette and results in a serious loss of face. How we were amused by these instructions when we first received them, but afterwards we were grateful enough for them. For example, I was invited to a banquet by the Oyen at whose house I was staying. Fortunately, I was careful to seek advice on correct behavior before going. When the dish arrived at the table, it was a whole roast lamb. My host ceremoniously cut off the head and handed it to me as a sign of respect, as I was his guest of honor. Then, equally ceremoniously, I passed the brains to my host and his wife, evidently surprised by such good manners. My host Oyen nodded, but when I proceeded to cut off the left ear and passed it to the eldest son, I was truly accepted, and from that moment on, the whole village considered me a man of the world, someone who knew how things worked. Unfortunately, not everyone took the same precautions. At the end of the fasting month of Ramadan, the Wiking KFs organised a huge and magnificent Bayram banquet for the German armed forces. A representative of the Ministry of Eastern Affairs came especially from Berlin for the occasion. You can imagine our horror when he began to deliver a thunderous speech after the banquet. After the meal, the man and women of the KFS, the host people, we felt very grateful for their visit and wished to show their gratitude. However, to our great good fortune, they had not understood a word, although the booming voice and broad gestures had obviously made a deep impression. Then Rittmeister Baron Hahn, who had been entrusted to act as interpreter, rose and, accompanied by the complicit smiles of the other interpreters present, gave a brilliant translation of the speech in a form completely acceptable to the Caucasian mentality. It ran more or less as follows. Long ago, news reached us that here, in the Upper Caucasus, there was a worthy and noble people, the Karks. We thought long and hard about how we could best help you. Now, Arkansas Führer has sent his armed forces and liberated you, etc. When he sat down, the Karks burst into frenzied applause, and their elders assured us that they would do everything in their power to help us. We sighed with relief. If the Berlin gentleman's speech had been translated literally, it would have been considered a grave insult and could have led to political disaster in the Caucasus. The political expert from Berlin was immensely surprised by the laughter that greeted him when he later said arrogantly, puffing out his chest, "You see, gentlemen, that's how you talk to these people. That's the language they understand. It gets to the heart." No one said anything. It would have been too dangerous. Moreover, the mentality of these Caucasian tribes offered us tremendous opportunities, although it required empathy and a certain sensitivity. This was clearly demonstrated in the case of the special advisor to the Kalmuku, whose name I will not mention, as he now lives in eastern Germany. This brilliant and enterprising ethnic German from the Sudetenland region devoted himself tirelessly to the cause of the Kalmuk tribes, and instilled so much confidence in them that they were soon willing to submit their problems unconditionally to his judgment. Among his friends and acquaintances, he became known as the King of the Kalmuku. None of us took our friend's work very seriously, seeing it more as a personal hobby. You can imagine our surprise when a delegation of Kalmuk elders appeared at the headquarters. One day, to inform us that all the elders had sent orders through subway channels to their fellow tribesmen in the Red Army to return immediately to the Caucasus and fight on our side against Bolshevism. They also said that the Buddhist Kalmyks had even sent messengers to Tibet to inform the Dalai Lama of events in the Caucasus and to promote Germany's interests there. This turned out to be much more fruitful work than the endless discussions about what to do with the mountain Jews of Dagestan once we had taken their capital, the Caspian port of Makhatala, around the year 1000. Several larger hill tribes living in Dagestan, in the eastern highlands of the Caucasus, converted to the Jewish faith, although by race and ancestry they were purely Aryan. Although they remained faithful to their new religion, they avoided any racial mixing, so they were undoubtedly genuine Aryan Jews. Ethnologists even went so far as to say that they were direct descendants of the Goths. So, were they Aryans or Jews? Would we consider them friends or foes? Military developments relieved our theorists of any such moral dilemma. We never made it to Dagestan. In general, our treatment of the population in the Caucasus was 100 times better than in the fertile plains of the Ukraine, where the first partisan groups of a certain size were just beginning to appear. In fact, I did not know that Koch and Sakal were beginning their mass recruitment of manpower in eastern Torito Ras, and that the Caucasus was, in fact, the only praiseworthy exception on the entire Eastern Front. We didn't know any of that. We just knew that we were moving into position at Kishny Kub. My gun was well camouflaged, half buried in a deep ditch, and we had spent the night free from enemy air raids. When the messenger came to wake us up in the morning, the 5 of us were already up and moving. My adjutant, a young soldier from Schleswig-Holstein, pulled me aside for a moment. I was surprised, for despite his youth, Heine was already an old warrior, and usually only raw troops delivered letters from home before battle. Heine handed me 2 photographs, one of a very pretty girl, and the other of a rather ordinary girl. "Which one do you think I should marry?" he asked me. "That's a hard question to answer on an empty stomach," I said, trying to evade the problem because I knew that, according to Heine, my judgment was infallible. And this one? What do you think of her? He passed me the picture of the ordinary girl. She looks reliable, I replied, for lack of anything better to say. The 19-year-old's face lit up. Exactly what I think. She's had a child by me, and she's always writing and sending me packages. She's very worried about me. I've decided to write my old man today. I want the kid to work on the farm if I ever mess up. We laughed. Then came the order, start the engines. Within minutes we began to move forward, and immediately there was activity at every step. I had not realized the night before how large our force was. There were at least 100 armoured vehicles of all sizes. All of Mullen's battalion was there. Our company, the 3rd Anti-Tank Company, was somewhere in the centre of the force, secure. But we had not advanced far from Nish CB when we received the order to close the gap with the forward tanks. After all, our usual luck was still intact, and all was still quiet as we advanced over hills and deep gorges. Suddenly a thunderous roar from far away broke the peace of the morning. They were very heavy calibers, and the shells were already hitting a wide, deep tank trench that opened up in our path just ahead. Armoured engineers dismounted from their vehicles and worked calmly to advance their demolition charges. Then a smart bang was heard against the side of my crew compartment. There were infantry there, something we had not expected. They were well entrenched in the gorges, which were covered with tall mountain grass, and they were holding out. No muzzle flashes could be seen, but there was no mistaking the sound of the bullets. Fascinated, I watched through my sights as a tall Oberstführer advanced without cover through the deluge of fire. He was carrying charges attached against the wall of the tank trench. Suddenly there was a bang. The bastards had fired my sights. When I raised my head above the cannon armour, Obersturmführer Führer had disappeared, literally shattered by a shell. The next man crawled forward and lit the fuse. Then I saw him give a jerk, roll over and stand still. Meanwhile, bullets whistled overhead, and I had to duck my head. An enemy platoon was evidently paying special attention to us, probably because, being on the extreme left, we were the best target. Now, heavy shells were falling all around us continuously, and I watched with envy as the tanks closed their hatches, while we remained exposed above and behind. Then the first charge exploded, and the next moment, the second, and then another one. I couldn't understand how the sappers had managed to do it in the face of such fire. The first tanks were already advancing across the ditch that had failed to stop our attack. Following close behind, my gun went down, and then came back up. When I came back up, I saw to my horror that 2 of our tanks were already on fire, probably from direct hits or mines. But I had no time to lose. Shells were falling everywhere. I changed position constantly and varied my speed during the advance, using every possible maneuver to lessen the danger. Suddenly I felt something wet on the back of my neck. It was blood. I felt again, but I was not wounded. Then I saw blood, deep red blood dripping from the cracks around the gunner's position. I shouted over the intercom to the gunner, "Are you hurt, Carl?" "No, not me," he replied. And then, a second later, his voice came again, "I think Hoon's hurt. Hand me a first aid kit, quick." I handed him the first aid kit, but soon after he said quietly, "I think Hoon's hurt. I've already used 5 bandages. Hoon is unconscious." "Careful," I shouted. "Keep your head down." As soon as I finished speaking, I heard him scream. Immediately I perched on the gun armour and with a savage assault landed beside him. He had been hit, harmlessly enough, in the jaw, but Hoon was in bad shape. An exploding bullet had ripped open his lower belly. After dressing Carl's wound, I put the first high-explosive shell into the barrel, turned sharply and fired into the nearest gorge. Then I fired again. The enemy fire did indeed slow down a bit, although I had to fire blindly. Suddenly the radio operator, who was also manning the anti-aircraft machine gun, shouted something. "There's movement over there," he shouted, and swung his machine gun around, firing several bursts, then stopped, cursing. One of the invisible snipers had put a bullet in his right arm. I jumped down, returning to the position of the commander of the piece, and gave him a first aid kit. Then we stopped next to the commander's vehicle. "Stuff." Führer was furious. "Go back as fast as you can and wait in the combat train. You will find it near Nish Kub." We turned and retreated at full speed. I was surprised to find that we had advanced about 9 kilometres. and that the infantry was still far behind at Nish Cub. As we retreated alone, the whole field seemed to suddenly come alive. We were taking heavy fire from every nook and cranny. Despite his wound, the radio operator opened fire with the machine gun, leaving a trail of bodies behind us. I sat at the rear of the gun with Carl, taking turns with the machine gun and throwing hand grenades, which we simply tossed behind us. One of them landed directly in a hole, and a Red Army man was thrown into the air. In every nook and cranny, despite his wound, the radio operator opened fire with the machine gun, leaving a trail of bodies behind us. I sat on the back of the gun with Carl, taking turns with the machine gun and throwing hand grenades. At one point, there was a man trotting nonchalantly behind us, carrying an anti-tank mine that he was apparently determined to throw against our cannon. I actually liked him, because he continued his task so cheerfully and with such zeal, undeterred by the threat behind us. But he did not mean well, and had to be dealt with. Finally, we saw the first buildings of Nish Cub, and I asked for directions to the main aid station. Hein was still alive when we pulled him out, but he was gone when the medic bent over him. Shaken, I received his effects, including the 2 photographs. The letter I had planned to write had been left unwritten. The 2 wounded members of my crew remained at the aid station. It was not easy to leave them behind. Carl kept muttering angrily, "Damn my luck." The radio operator asked me several times not to be angry with him, and that he would rather have stayed with the cannon. Tired and discouraged, the driver and I headed for the combat trains and found them not far away in a gorge. At that point we decided to rest. Soon, however, the first bombs began to fall, and although we had some luck at first, things became more complicated. At dusk, 3 replacements showed up to join our crew. Later, spies came to tell us to accompany the supply trucks to the front after dark. After some minor clashes along the way, we finally arrived back at the front with the 2 heavy trucks. In the meantime, our unit had become a defensive hedgehog in a huge cornfield. During that time, we suffered no damage from Stalin's first rockets, which miraculously fell without causing the slightest damage. Finally, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. At dawn, we were on the move again. The wide valley was shrouded in mist, and the hilltops glowed with deep red fire. To the left of our front, the oil town of Malgobec began to take shape against the slopes of the Dougalberg mountain. A large white house stood out in the darkness, illuminated by the first rays of the rising sun. Fuel tanks were hidden in the shadows below. To the right of Malgobec, in the valley, stood Sokopchin, like a sentry before the narrow gorge that formed the entrance to the Georgian military road. How many hundreds or thousands of years had soldiers marched, travelled, or ridden along this road? How much blood had been spilled on this fertile soil? The sun hung big and red in front of us, and mechanized infantry, mounted on their vehicles, sang the old soldiers' song at dawn, lighting the way to an early grave. A T-34 came into view about 2 kilometres away, then another. Our lead tanks pulled up, and a shell roared through the morning air. It was a direct hit, and the first Soviet tank burst into flames. We moved at full speed, with the first wave of tanks in front and our 3rd company behind them. Once again we were the outside gun on the left flank. In front of us, 50 Soviet tanks appeared, and then 100. It was a general relief. The hour of decision had come, and we were in the middle of a big battle. The Soviet armoured force was steadily reinforced as more and more tanks came out of the hiding places where they had waited for us. From small defiles behind houses and haystacks, they advanced towards us and opened fire. The surrounding hills were suddenly alive. Artillery, anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns were firing a hail of shells and bullets of all calibers at us. Large ground fountains leaped into the middle of our formation, but there was still no work for my cannon. On the left flank, it was still quiet. I looked critically at the entire length of my sector, including the town on the Dougalberg, which at that time was a little behind our left flank. Suddenly, I saw a flash just to the right of the White House, a cannon flash. Out of habit, I began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The shell landed 3 meters to our left, causing the cannon to wobble. I immediately shifted my position to the left. Another flash from above, and I counted again. This time the shell hit about 10 meters away, to our right. A moment later, The company commander rushed by in his command vehicle, and I informed him about the enemy fire from Malbec. He laughed aloud. "You're crazy! Malbec has been in our hands since early this morning." Then he left, shaking his head at my ignorance as a cannon commander. Another flash from above, and I changed position again, this time backing up. The shell landed exactly where we had been before. Soon I could make out at least 3 batteries firing at us from above. Soon after, the commander approached again. "You were right, damn it. The infantry regiment that attacked the city this morning suffered heavy casualties in their assault. You'd be better off firing on Malgoc's batteries for the time being. Nothing is happening here anyway." We turned around instead. At that point, our driver below us was frantic. "What the hell is going on up there? Are we falling back?" There is no one worse in a tank battle than the driver, as he can only see through his little scope and can never get a real sense of the battlefield. At this point, of course, we were having to expose our unprotected rear end toward the enemy attack. We fired again and again in rapid succession against the elevation. Soon our shells began to hit the White House and finally the front battery. We saw debris rise into the air. During all this time, I had to change position at more and more frequent intervals, as the enemy guns remaining were obviously concentrating on finishing us. During a brief pause at the fire, I took the opportunity to look around. The situation was not good at all. At least 30 of our tanks and guns were burning, and there was also considerable fire on the enemy side. To make matters worse, at least 300 T-34 were massing against us. Then, the loader reported that we had 3 rounds left. 80 millimeters, yes, I asked him. "Yes," he replied. Then I stiffened in my shooting fever. I had completely forgotten the need to economize and had fired all our ammunition. Now we were in quite a mess. I maneuvered immediately to the commander to report. The company commander said nothing. I offered to move to the rear and reload completely, but he shook his head. "The ammo carriers will be here any minute. Try to keep going as best you can until they get here and don't stay in one place too long or they will track you down." We ran around the battlefield for a while. It was not a pleasant feeling to have to wait as a fifth wheel and be a target in a firing range for the enemy. A few minutes later, the driver reported with irony, "Fuel for another 10 kilometers at most." I looked desperately for the ammunition holder, but it was still nowhere to be seen. In fact, it had been destroyed long before without our knowledge. The news about the fuel was the straw that broke the camel's back. Could it be that a shard had hit our fuel tank? But it didn't matter. We were finished. A little to our left, I saw a slight dip in the ground and ordered the gun to move to its lowest point, less than 3/4 of a meter deep, and we stopped there. "Well, gentlemen," said the gunner with black humour, "make this place your home." I hunkered down at my station and frantically tried to think of a solution. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of anything. Either way, we were in a bad situation. Number 2, a young recruit in his first battle, was looking at my station with envy, as it was better protected against shrapnel than his. I asked him quietly if he would mind switching places with me temporarily to go up top for a while. He nodded quickly and descended as I made my way to the gunner. He said nothing, and I had nothing to say either. We were both in our second year in the East and knew all too well what our situation meant. The recruit had left. It was a crumpled paperback novel that I picked up. I opened it, and the red light in the bar alternated with blue and green in a majestic play of colours. The soft music created an atmosphere of delicate refinement. I smiled and read on as shell explosions erupted around us and shrapnel whistled past in a frenzy of destruction. But I was absorbed in my paperback novel world. Suddenly I felt a tremendous blow to my stomach and was thrown upwards. For an instant I saw the gunner flying beside me and a fiery inferno below. When I touched thee, I realized it had been a direct hit. I was dazed on the ground, surrounded by burning fuel. I saw the young recruit desperately trying to free himself from the burning machine gun, but he fell back into the sea of fire. As I jumped, the exploding ammunition and grenades forced me back to the ground. Next to me, I heard a low moan. I looked around and saw the company commander crawling on the ground, bleeding and drenched in sweat. "What's going on?" he asked weakly. I pointed to the burning machine gun. "How many bullets do you have in your gun?" I didn't understand. "The usual, 16, I replied. He pointed to the Soviet tanks that had come within a couple of 100 yards and were full of mounted infantry. Our own tanks were retreating just ahead of us. There was a narrow puddle filled with fuel, about a foot deep. Crawling through it, the commander had a hard time. We later discovered that he had 14 shrapnel fragments in his shoulder. Our progress was painfully slow. Meanwhile, our tanks launched an immediate counterattack and managed to drive the Russians nearly a kilometre away, despite their numerical superiority. In response, the Russian batteries redoubled their fire, with shells falling in unbroken succession and shrapnel whistling and crackling just above us. We dared not even raise our heads to look around us. Finally, we came to a depression where mechanized infantry had gathered. We sighed with relief as we joined them. Soon after, a large formation of about 80 aircraft appeared on the horizon and approached us. At last, they were ours. It was time. Another sigh of relief ran through the ranks, but then a brittle voice said, "It's the Reds." It was true, we hadn't recognized them. They were Americans, part of the first American aid supplies to Russia. A second later, the first plane began its strafing pass, and machine gun bullets began to hit our ranks. The bombs fell and opened large gaps in the crowd of people below. During those eternal minutes, we lay rigid on the ground, hands clenched, awaiting death. The wounded men screamed. 20 meters in front and another 20 meters behind, many no longer screamed. They were the lucky ones. And finally, the skies emptied. 2 German fighter planes flew overhead. We didn't know whether to laugh or cry. We had long since exhausted all our field bandages. Then we crawled over piles of dead and wounded. The enemy fire had not abated for a second. I took a machine gun from a neighbouring company that was damaged, and on its way back some tank fire followed us, but fell short. I wiped the blood from my face, some of my own from some shrapnel scratches I had received, and some of my comrades'. When I looked in a mirror, I shuddered in horror. My face was completely blackened from the blast and slightly blackened from the explosion, scorched by hot oil or fuel. I hadn't noticed anything. When the cannon stopped at Nish Kub, I fell exhausted and stayed where I had fallen. I was completely exhausted, but not so the company commander, who, despite his 14 shrapnel fragments, picked up a couple of repaired machine guns from the maintenance company, found crews for them, and went to the aid of our hard-pressed comrades. A little later, I heard the news that a close friend of mine, Frit, had been killed just beyond the tank pit. He was the 30th man of my main unit to fall. Our division lost about 1,500 men in the fighting around Malbec and Sopin, and the graves beside the tank pit became a small city of the dead. A few days later, we found ourselves again in heavy fighting around Malgobek, which we finally managed to take. This town was the key to the whole position, and without it, our attack had little chance of success. I could not understand why the Russians had not simply taken a dozen tanks and a handful of infantry to close off the fourth side of the broad valley of which they already held the other 3. Not a single one of us would have made it out alive. Soon after, a special mission took me to Kislovodsk and once again to Russia. These were charming, well-kept villages, from the time of the Tsar, with the addition, of course, of the usual monumental palaces of the Soviet bureaucracy. Among them were Yesentuki, Pyatigorsk and Kislovodsk, the town where Lermontov had written A Hero of Our Time and was murdered in 1841, and where Pushkin wrote his Prisoners of the Caucasus. There, I met friends from my native country. We talked and drank until dawn. From there, I headed for Kotk, where relations with the civilian population seemed to be in a happy and normal state, especially with the Muslims, who looked favourably upon us and were intensely anti-communist. As I entered the town, I came upon a battalion of Karachev cavalry heading for the mountains, singing and having a good time. They were splendid men, lean and tanned, riding as if they were made for it. In Kislovodsk, I became casual friends with several professors from Leningrad University, mainly from the Faculty of Medicine. They had been evacuated from Leningrad to the Caucasus, probably to prevent members of Russian intelligence from falling into our hands. All were working in German military hospitals. These men were serious senior medical professionals, many of whom had studied in Germany and Vienna. Yet the stories they had to tell about Leningrad could have come out of the wildest imagination. The city had been so poorly supplied that a complete famine had broken out only a few weeks after the start of the German siege. Dogs, cats, and rats soon became delicacies beyond the reach of ordinary people. Scenes of cannibalism, reminiscent of the Great Famine of 1921, were daily occurrences. The dead were kept secret for weeks so that relatives or people in the same building could continue to collect rations from the deceased. Bodies lay rotting under the beds. Anyone who was sick or weak and ventured out into the street was immediately surrounded by gangs of hungry children or young men, as if they were wolves. Anyone who had the misfortune to collapse in the street was stripped of his clothes and shoes. There was a strict law that the caretaker of the house in front of which a dead person was found was responsible for the burial. The result was that most caretakers kept a constant vigil, and the moment someone died, they would quickly strip the body of all its belongings and drag it to the next house to burden the man next door with the job that everyone had grown too weak to do. When the first evacuation trains finally left the dying city, the bodies of the people who died on the trip were simply thrown out the window at each station. They could not travel with them, and the other passengers needed the space. The railroad track was littered with naked corpses. "It was absolute hell," said an old professor, shuddering and covering his eyes with his trembling hands. "I don't know where we got the strength to survive all that, and it really wouldn't have been that hard to supply the city with food. But it was easier that way. Only the privileged and the army needed to stay alive. We were doomed to a horrible and gruesome death. Most of the professors had lost many family members in the Leningrad House of Horrors. I left the colony of Russian academics in complete shock. Measured against such an experience, even the bloodiest battle lost half its terror." I wandered aimlessly through the streets. The sound of balalaika filtered from cafes and bars. Wounded soldiers paraded down the promenade arm in arm with young Caucasian girls or Norwegian or Flemish nurses in the twilight. Candles in the small Orthodox church flickered softly. Inside, the door was wide open. I hesitated for a moment and then entered. There were some of the faithful old men and women kneeling on the stone floor. I was sure that God had given us a great mission, a difficult but noble mission. If only we were able to understand it and prove ourselves worthy of it. May the generous German heart struggle with it and pour all its strength into its fulfillment. May the blood of the millions of our dead be the seed of eternal friendship with the liberated peoples of the steppes and mountains of the East, for the benefit of all mankind, I thought. I entered a small bar where Caucasian and Muslim music was being played. The monotony of the music had driven away all the German troops, and the place was almost exclusively occupied by the local population. A Luftwaffe man asked me if there was room at my table. Gradually we began to talk. "You know, that's how I feel about it," he said with relief. "I've just returned from leave in West Germany, where my father-in-law runs a large munitions factory. The women workers, Russian women, most of them Ukrainian, are housed in barracks surrounded by barbed wire. These wretched women, many of whom are volunteers who were brought to Germany with grandiose promises, are held as convicts, only allowed to leave in pairs under escort, like in an orphanage. It's total madness. I did what I could to make people understand, but it's like a drop of water on a hot stove. Then I was posted to the Salt Pass, which connects the Kalmyk steppe with the Caspian Sea in the north of the country. During our stay there, we met a Cossack regiment that was doing magnificent work against the enemy in that area. The few hours I spent with the old colonel of that regiment were an absolute tonic. This East Prussian officer, a man in his 60s, was the idol of his Cossacks, whom he treated as equals. He could get anything from them, he treated them as human beings, and in turn was respected as a human being by them. Long afterwards, I learned that this regiment, like the Kasian division, was annihilated to the last man after the death of its colonel. Not a single Cossack surrendered, even though their position, covering the German retreat, was hopeless. But at that time, a retreat was not yet thought of. Nalchik fell, the capital of the Soviet Autonomous Republic of the CFS and Karbina, soon after. Then I was called home a second time to spend another few months putting everything in order in the office. This time, I kept a low profile. The story the Luftwaffe man told me was completely confirmed by what I saw. In fact, conditions in some places were worse. After I had been back for a week, Joseph Burkle called me. "How are things going in the East?" he asked me. "As reported in the daily reports of the German armed forces," I answered laconically. He said nothing. I see that the Ukrainians are being treated like convicts. They came here to help us defeat Bolshevism, and now they are behind barbed wire. They are worse fed than the German people, but they are expected to do the hardest work. If this is happening here, what do you think is happening in the East? Burkle quickly changed the subject, asking me about the morale of the troops and the fighting I had been involved in. I told him the truth straight out. A few days later, I noticed that he began making surprise inspections of the housing and food conditions of the Ukrainian workers. Several weeks later, I saw a confidential directive to factory managers to treat their workers in the East with humanity and fairness. He became increasingly friendly with me whenever we met, and we had frequent and long conversations, almost invariably about the East, hoping, as I did, for a new turn in the situation. I soon discovered that he was toying with a plan to replace the nefarious Erich Koch in the Ukraine, a project that would have been beneficial to Germany, but which ultimately fell apart due to partisan intrigue. However, I was relieved to know that I had managed to win over at least one man who, while not at the top, certainly wielded great influence. So much for today's video. Remember to subscribe and leave your like so we keep bringing content for all of you. See you next time.